I still remember every detail of that Tuesday afternoon like it happened yesterday, even though it's been 3 years now. Some stories just burn themselves into your memory, you know. This is one of those stories that makes you realize how quick we are to judge, how little we really know about the people around us, and how sometimes the universe has a way of setting things right in the most unexpected ways. I was sitting in my usual spot at Murphy's Diner on 5th Street, nursing my second cup of coffee and pretending to read the newspaper while actually people-watching through the big plate glass window. It's a habit I picked up after retirement. Martha always said I was too nosy for my own good, but hell, when you've got time to kill and the coffee's decent, why not see what the world's up to? The diner sits right at the corner where the nicer part of downtown meets what the city council likes to call the transitional neighborhood. Translation: where the folks with money bump up against the folks without. It's the kind of place where you see all types, which is exactly why I like it. Plus, they make a mean apple pie. And at 72, I figure I've earned the right to eat pie whenever I damn well please. Anyway, I was watching this old guy across the street, and something about him caught my attention. He was probably in his late 80s, maybe early 90s, walking with this careful, measured pace that told you his body had been through some serious miles. He had on this old brown jacket that had seen better days, probably bought it sometime in the Carter administration, and he was carrying this worn canvas bag like he was heading to the grocery store. But it wasn't his clothes that made me keep watching. It was the way he carried himself. Even with the obvious arthritis in his shoulders and the careful way he placed each step, there was something about his posture that screamed military. I should know. I did my time in the Army. Nothing heroic, just 2 years in Germany during the tail end of Vietnam. But you learn to recognize that bearing, that automatic straightness of the spine that never really goes away, no matter how old you get. The old man was heading toward the bus stop in front of the Quickie Mart, where a group of teenagers had set up camp for the afternoon. Now, I've got nothing against kids, raised 3 of my own, but this particular bunch had been causing problems in the neighborhood for months. Not serious crime, mind you, just that low-level jackass behavior that makes everyone's life a little bit worse. Loitering, littering, being loud and obnoxious, making elderly folks and young mothers cross the street to avoid them. There were 5 of them that day, all boys probably around 16 or 17. The kind of kids who think the world owes them something but haven't figured out what yet. They were sprawled all over the bus stop bench and the area around it, their backpacks and skateboards taking up every available inch of space, making it impossible for anyone else to use the stop. I watched as the old man approached, and I could already feel tension building in my gut. I'd seen this movie before, and it usually didn't end well for the senior citizen. The old guy stopped about 10 feet from the group and cleared his throat. "Excuse me, fellas," he said, and even from across the street I could hear that his voice had that particular gravelly quality that comes from years of shouting orders over machinery and gunfire. "I'm trying to catch the 2:15 bus. Mind if I squeeze in there?" The kids looked up from their phones, and immediately I could see the calculation happening in their eyes. Here was this old man, clearly not a threat, asking them politely to share public space. To them, he probably looked like an easy target, someone they could push around to impress each other. The apparent leader of the group, a tall kid with that sullen expression teenagers perfect around age 15, made a big show of looking around. "Gee, I don't know, old man. Looks pretty crowded here." His friend snickered, and I could see him puffing up with the attention. "I don't need much room," the old man said, still polite, but with a slight edge creeping into his voice that made me sit up straighter. "Just a place to sit while I wait for the bus." "Yeah, well, maybe you should have thought of that before you got old and slow," another kid chimed in, a shorter boy with a backwards baseball cap. "There's another stop 6 blocks down. Might do you some good to walk it." I felt my jaw clench. 6 blocks doesn't sound like much when you're 17, but when you're pushing 90 and every step is an effort, it might as well be 6 miles. The old man stood there for a moment, and I could see him weighing his options. He could turn around and walk away, accept the humiliation and the extra strain on his aging body. He could try to reason with these kids, probably waste his breath and miss his bus in the process. Or he could stand his ground. He chose option 3. "Son," he said, stepping a little closer, "I've been riding this bus line for 15 years. I pay my taxes, I follow the rules, and I treat people with respect. I'm asking you to do the same." That's when the situation went from uncomfortable to ugly, real fast. The leader stood up, and Christ, he was tall, probably 6'3", with that lanky teenage build that's all elbows and attitude. He stepped right into the old man's personal space, clearly trying to intimidate him. "Oh, what are you gonna do about it, Gramps? Call the cops? Tell my mommy?" His friends were eating it up, laughing and making comments. But I noticed something they didn't. The old man didn't back down, not even an inch. He stood there, looking up at this kid who towered over him, and his expression was completely calm. Not scared, not angry, just calm. It was the kind of calm that should have been a warning sign, but these kids were too stupid to read it. "I'm asking nicely," the old man said. "Just want to sit down and wait for my bus." "And I'm telling you to take a hike," the kid shot back. Then he did something that made my blood boil. He reached out and gave the old man a hard shove on the shoulder, not enough to knock him down, but enough to make him stumble back a few steps. That's when everything changed. I saw it in the old man's eyes first, a flash of something that had been buried deep but never forgotten. His hand came up automatically, not to rub his shoulder where he'd been shoved, but to steady himself in a way that looked suspiciously like muscle memory from combat training. His feet shifted into a wider stance, his center of gravity lowered just slightly, and for about 2 seconds he looked like he was calculating exactly how to take down all 5 of these kids without breaking a sweat. But then reality set in. He was 90 years old, they were teenagers, and this wasn't 1952 in Korea or 1968 in Vietnam. His shoulders sagged just a little, and he stepped back. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll walk to the other stop." The kids erupted in laughter, high-fiving each other like they'd just won the Super Bowl. "Yeah, that's right," the leader called after him. "Walk it off, old-timer." "Maybe next time you'll think twice before bothering your betters." I was already reaching for my wallet to pay my check and get the hell out of there before I did something stupid, when the short kid with the backwards cap decided he wasn't done yet. "Hey!" he yelled at the old man, who had made it maybe 20 feet down the sidewalk. "You dropped something!" The old man turned around, confused, and the kid launched an empty soda can that hit him square in the chest. Not hard enough to cause real damage, but hard enough to be humiliating. The can bounced off and clattered into the gutter. "Oops," the kid said with a nasty grin. "My bad." That's when I lost it. I threw a $10 bill on the table and was out of that diner faster than I'd moved in years. I'm not proud of what I was planning to do. A 68-year-old man getting into a fight with a bunch of teenagers isn't exactly the stuff of heroic legend, but I couldn't just sit there and watch. By the time I made it across the street, though, the damage was done. The old man was walking away, his shoulders hunched with humiliation, while the kids had gone back to their phones and their self-congratulation. I thought about following him, making sure he was okay, but pride's a funny thing. Sometimes the last thing a man wants is pity, even when it comes from a place of genuine concern. Instead, I found myself standing there staring at these 5 kids who thought they were so damn clever. The leader noticed me watching and gave me a challenging look, like he was hoping I'd give him an excuse to show off some more. "What are you looking at, old man?" he said. "Just wondering," I replied. "If your parents know what kind of people they raised." His face darkened. "Why don't you mind your own business?" "Maybe I will," I said. "Or maybe I'll stick around and see what happens when someone your own size comes along." It was a hollow threat. I was probably the oldest person on the block at that moment, but it was enough to make them nervous. They gathered up their stuff and moved on, probably looking for easier targets. I should have let it go. Should have gone back to my coffee and my newspaper and chalked it up to kids being kids and old men being vulnerable, and the world being generally unfair. But something about that old guy stuck with me. Maybe it was the military bearing, maybe it was the way he'd handled himself with such dignity even while being humiliated. Or maybe it was just that I'd been that age once and knew how it felt to have the world treat you like you were invisible. Whatever it was, I decided to follow him. I caught up about 3 blocks down where he was sitting on a different bus stop bench, checking his watch. Up close, I could see more details. His jacket wasn't just old, it was quality. The kind of wool blend that lasts for decades if you take care of it. His shoes were polished military style, and despite their age, they were in better shape than most people's dress shoes. But it was his hands that really caught my attention. They were scarred in the particular way that comes from working with machinery and tools, but they were also marked with small burns and cuts that spoke to a different kind of work entirely. "Excuse me," I said, sitting down on the other end of the bench. "I saw what happened back there. Are you all right?" He looked at me with sharp blue eyes that seemed to be evaluating whether I was another threat or just a concerned stranger. After a moment, he nodded. "I'm fine, thank you. Just waiting for the next bus." "Those kids were way out of line," I said. I was about to come over and say something, but by the time I got across the street— "Appreciate the thought," he said. "But I've handled worse." There was something in the way he said it that made me believe him completely. This wasn't bravado or tough guy posturing. It was just a statement of fact. "I'm Tom Patterson," I said, extending my hand. He shook it with a grip that was still firm despite his age. "Frank Kowalski. Nice to meet you, Tom." "Frank Kowalski," I repeated, thinking the name sounded familiar. "Were you in the service, Frank?" His expression shifted slightly, and I saw a flicker of that same wariness I'd noticed when he was dealing with the teenagers. "Long time ago," he said. "What branch?" "Marines," he said, and there it was. That automatic straightening of the spine that I'd noticed from across the street. "You?" "Army. Nothing special, just did my time in Germany." He nodded, and I could see him relaxing a little. There's a fraternity among veterans, even across service branches, that's hard to explain to civilians. It's not that we all have war stories to share, or that we all agree on politics or anything like that. It's just that we understand certain things about each other without having to explain them. "What unit?" I asked. "1st Battalion, 9th Marines," he said. "The Walking Dead." I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew that unit designation, and I knew why they called them the Walking Dead. It was a nickname earned through some of the bloodiest fighting in Vietnam, in places like Khe Sanh and Con Thien. These weren't just Marines. These were the Marines who'd held impossible positions against impossible odds and somehow lived to tell about it. "Jesus Christ," I said. "Khe Sanh?" His eyes sharpened, and for a moment I could see past the 90-year-old man to the 19-year-old Marine who'd faced down North Vietnamese regulars in the mountains of South Vietnam. "You know about Khe Sanh?" "My brother-in-law was there," I said. "Different unit, but he told me stories. Said it was 7 months of pure hell." Frank nodded slowly. 77 days under siege. Lost a lot of good men." We sat in silence for a moment, and I found myself looking at this old man with entirely new eyes. Frank Kowalski wasn't just some elderly guy getting pushed around by punks. He was a survivor of one of the most brutal battles in American military history, a man who'd seen things that would break most people, and had somehow found the strength to keep going for 50 years afterward. "You know," I said, "I've got some time to kill. Mind if I wait with you? Maybe buy you a cup of coffee while we're at it?" He studied my face for a moment, probably trying to figure out if this was pity or genuine friendship. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him. "Coffee sounds good," he said. There was a small cafe about half a block from the bus stop, the kind of neighborhood place that survives on regulars and refuses to acknowledge that Starbucks exists. We ordered coffee and found a quiet table by the window where Frank could keep an eye on the bus stop. "So what brings you to this part of town?" I asked. "Doctor's appointment," he said. "VA clinic. Nothing serious, just routine checkup." "You live around here?" "About 10 miles north. Usually my granddaughter drives me, but she's got school today." He paused, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Bus isn't so bad. Gives me a chance to see the city." I almost asked about his family then, but something in his expression warned me off. There's a particular kind of loneliness that some older people carry, and I was starting to recognize it in Frank. It's not the obvious kind that makes people complain or seek attention. It's the quiet kind that accepts isolation as the natural order of things and doesn't expect anything different. Instead, I changed the subject. How long were you in the Corps? 26 years, he said. Enlisted in 62, retired in 88 as a master gunnery sergeant. Christ, you were a lifer. What'd you do after? Worked construction for a while, then factory work. Retired about 10 years ago when my back finally gave out. It was a common story among men of his generation. Military service followed by blue-collar work until your body couldn't take it anymore. But there was something in the way he said it that suggested there was more to the story. Must have been tough, adjusting to civilian life after 26 years. He nodded. Marines prepare you for a lot of things. Civilian life isn't really one of them. We drank our coffee in comfortable silence for a while, watching the street through the window. The bus Frank needed came and went while we were talking, but he didn't seem concerned. There'd be another one in an hour. You know, I said after a while, those kids back at the bus stop, they have no idea what they were messing with. Frank's mouth turned up in what might have been a smile. They're just kids, Tom. Stupid kids, but kids all the same. Still, I said, if they knew who you were, what you'd done, what difference would it make? He asked. Ancient history. I'm just an old man waiting for a bus now. But that's where Frank was wrong, and I was about to find out just how wrong. We were finishing our coffee when I heard a commotion outside. Through the window, I could see a crowd gathering near the bus stop where Frank had been harassed earlier. There were police cars, an ambulance, and what looked like a news van pulling up. What the hell? I muttered, standing up to get a better look. Frank joined me at the window, and we watched as paramedics wheeled a gurney toward the ambulance. I couldn't see who was on it, but whoever it was looked small, kid-sized. Should we go see what happened? I asked. Frank was already reaching for his jacket. Come on. We made our way across the street, where a crowd of maybe 30 people had gathered. I spotted a police officer I recognized, Mike Rodriguez, whose kid had been in Little League with my youngest boy about 15 years ago. Mike, I called. What's going on? He turned and nodded at me. Tom, hey, bad accident. One of those teenagers who hang out around here got hit by a car. I felt my stomach drop. How bad? Bad enough. Driver says the kid ran right out into traffic like he was being chased or something. Witnesses say the same thing. I looked around and spotted 3 of the 5 kids from earlier, clustered together near the Quickie Mart. They looked scared out of their minds, pale and shaky in the way that comes from seeing something terrible happen to someone you know. Which kid? I asked. Short one with the backwards baseball cap, Mike said. You know him? I knew him all right. He was the one who'd thrown the soda can at Frank. I glanced over at Frank, who was listening to our conversation with a carefully neutral expression. Any idea what spooked him? I asked. Mike shrugged. Kids are saying they saw someone following them. Big guy, maybe military, asking questions about what happened earlier at the bus stop. Frank and I exchanged glances. Military? I said. Yeah, that's what they said. But nobody else saw this guy, so who knows? Kids get spooked, they run, accidents happen. Mike's radio crackled and he excused himself to respond. I turned to Frank, who was watching the ambulance pull away with an unreadable expression. You think this has something to do with what happened earlier? I don't know, he said. But I think maybe we should talk to those boys. The 3 remaining kids were still huddled together, looking like they wanted to be anywhere else in the world. As we approached, I could see they were having an argument in hushed tones. Told you we should have just left him alone. Wasn't my idea to throw that can. What if that guy comes back? They noticed us coming and immediately went silent, watching Frank with expressions that bordered on terror. Which was interesting, because 20 minutes ago, they'd been laughing at him. Boys, Frank said, his voice carrying that particular tone of authority that makes teenagers automatically stand up straighter. I understand there was some confusion earlier about what happened at the bus stop. The tallest kid, the leader from before, swallowed hard.
We didn't mean anything by it, sir. We were just messing around.
Messing around, Frank repeated. Is that what you call pushing an old man and throwing things at him?
Look, we're sorry, okay?
Another kid said. We already told the cops everything we know about Danny running into the street. Danny, that's your friend who got hurt? They nodded in unison, looking like they were about to cry. Tell me about the man who was asking questions, Frank said. The boys looked at each other nervously. Finally, the leader spoke up. He was big, like really big, wearing some kind of uniform or military clothes or something. He knew Danny's name, knew what happened at the bus stop. What did he want to know? He asked if we knew who you were, the second kid said. Asked if we realized what we'd done. Frank's expression didn't change, but I could see something shifting behind his eyes. What did you tell him? We told him we didn't know anything about you, that you were just some old guy waiting for the bus. And he laughed. Laughed? Yeah, like we'd said something really stupid. Then he said something about how we'd picked the wrong old man to mess with and how respect was about to be taught the hard way. The third kid, who hadn't spoken yet, suddenly burst out. He knew your name, sir. He called you Master Gunnery Sergeant Kowalski, said you were a goddamn American hero and we better hope nothing happened to you after what we did. Frank went very still. He knew my rank? Yes, sir. And he said if anything happened to you because of what we did, if you had a heart attack or fell down or anything, he was going to hold us personally responsible. I could see Frank processing this information, and I could tell he was putting pieces together faster than I was. Someone had recognized him. Someone who knew his military background and took it seriously enough to track down these kids and put the fear of God into them. What did this man look like? Frank asked. Big, the leader said again. Maybe 40, 45? Short hair, really straight posture. Had these intense eyes, you know? And when he talked, it was like he expected you to do exactly what he said. Scars? The boys looked at each other. Yeah, one of them said. On his hands and his neck, like burn scars or something. Frank nodded slowly, and I saw recognition dawn on his face. Did he give you his name? No, sir, but Danny asked if he was a cop and the guy said no. He was just someone who believes in respect for veterans. Then Danny got mouthy, started saying how it was a free country and he could treat anyone however he wanted. And the guy just looked at him for like 10 seconds without saying anything. Then he said, "Son, freedom isn't free, and respect isn't optional. You're about to learn both of those lessons the hard way." That's when the kid had panicked and run, straight into traffic. Frank was quiet for a long moment, staring off toward where the ambulance had disappeared. Finally, he looked back at the boys. Is Danny going to be okay? We don't know, one of them said. He was conscious when they put him in the ambulance, but his leg looked really messed up. I want you boys to listen to me very carefully, Frank said. What happened to your friend was an accident, brought on by his own poor choices. But accidents can become tragedies real quick if people don't learn from them. They nodded rapidly. I'm going to the hospital to check on Danny. When he's feeling better, you're all going to come see me, and we're going to have a conversation about respect, responsibility, and the consequences of actions. Understood? Yes, sir. Good. And boys, next time you see an elderly person who needs help, or a veteran, or frankly anyone who's just trying to go about their business in peace, you remember this day. You remember that actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences come from directions you never expected. As we walked away from the bus stop, I found myself looking at Frank with new eyes yet again. There was clearly more to this story than met the eye. You know who that was, don't you? I said. The guy who scared those kids. Frank nodded. I think so. If I'm right, his name is Bobby Chen. Sergeant Bobby Chen, United States Marine Corps. How do you know him? Frank stopped walking and turned to look at me. Tom, I need to tell you something about what really happened in Vietnam, and why someone like Bobby Chen might care enough about an old Marine to put the fear of God into a bunch of teenagers. We found another coffee shop, this one quieter and more private. And Frank began to tell me a story that I'd never heard before. Not in history books, not in war movies, not in any of the sanitized versions of Vietnam that most Americans carry around in their heads. Khe Sanh, Frank began, was more than just a battle. It was 77 days of pure hell. But it was also where I learned what the words, "leave no one behind," really mean. He told me about a night in February 1968 when his squad had been cut off from the main base during a North Vietnamese assault. They were pinned down in a bombed-out bunker with 3 wounded Marines and no way to call for help. The enemy was closing in, ammunition was running low, and it looked like they were all going to die on a mountainside 10,000 miles from home. Bobby Chen was 19 years old, Frank said. Kid from San Francisco. Family had been in America for exactly 1 generation. His father had fought with the Chinese nationalists against the Japanese, came to America after the war with nothing but the clothes on his back and a determination to give his son a better life. Frank's voice took on that particular tone that veterans use when they're remembering the men they served with. Equal parts pride and sadness, love and loss. Bobby had only been in country for 3 weeks, green as grass, scared out of his mind. But he had this incredible sense of duty. When the call came for volunteers to try to reach our position, Bobby was the first one to step forward. What followed was a story of courage that belonged in the history books but would probably never make it there. Bobby Chen had crawled through 2 miles of enemy-controlled territory, dodging patrols and artillery, carrying medical supplies and ammunition. He'd made it to Frank's position just as the North Vietnamese were preparing for a final assault. But here's the thing, Frank said. Bobby didn't just bring supplies. He brought hope. He looked at us, 5 Marines who thought we were going to die in that bunker, and he said, "Gunny, we're going home tonight. All of us." And somehow, impossibly, they had. Bobby Chen had guided them through the darkness, past enemy positions, back to American lines. All 5 wounded Marines had survived. Frank had recommended Bobby for the Silver Star, but paperwork has a way of getting lost in war zones, and Bobby's heroism had been officially forgotten. "But I never forgot," Frank said. "None of us did. Bobby and I stayed in touch after the war. He did 20 years in the Corps, retired as a master sergeant. Last I heard, he was working private security in the city." I was starting to understand. "And he recognized your name somehow?" "Bobby Chen has a memory like a steel trap, and he's spent 50 years keeping track of every Marine he ever served with. If those kids had mentioned my name anywhere within 50 miles of where Bobby lives or works, word would have gotten back to him within hours." "So he decided to teach them a lesson." Frank's expression darkened. "Bobby takes the Marine Corps motto very seriously. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. To him, disrespecting a Marine, especially an older Marine who can't defend himself, is like spitting on the flag." I thought about what the kids had described, a big man with scars and burn marks, someone who spoke with absolute authority and expected to be obeyed. It fit the profile of a career Marine who'd seen serious combat. "You think he meant for that kid to get hurt?" "No," Frank said quickly. "Bobby's not a violent man, Tom. He's a professional. But he understands fear, and he knows how to use it. He probably just wanted to explain to those boys why treating veterans with disrespect was a bad idea." And the kid panicked. Kids that age don't have much experience with real consequences. Most of the adults in their lives threaten them with detention or taking away their phones. When they run into someone who represents genuine adult-world consequences for their actions, they don't know how to handle it. We finished our coffee in silence, both of us thinking about the chain of events that had led from a simple act of teenage cruelty to a kid lying in a hospital bed with a broken leg. "So what now?" I asked. Frank checked his watch. "Now I go to the hospital and check on Danny. Then I'm going to have a long conversation with Bobby Chen about the difference between teaching respect and scaring kids into traffic. Want some company? He looked at me for a moment, and I could see him weighing the offer. You don't have to do this, Tom.
It's not your problem.
Maybe not, I said. But I've got nothing better to do, and I'd like to see how this story ends. The hospital was a 20-minute bus ride away, during which Frank told me more about his time in Vietnam and his friendship with Bobby Chen. It painted a picture of two men who'd been forged by combat into something harder and more durable than most people ever have to become, but who'd also learned the value of loyalty and brotherhood in ways that civilian life rarely teaches. Danny Kowalski, no relation to Frank, just one of those coincidences, was in stable condition with a broken leg and some bruises. He'd been lucky. A few feet in either direction and the car would have killed him instead of just knocking him down. Frank asked to see him, and after some discussion with the doctors and Danny's parents, we were allowed into his room. The kid looked small and pale against the white hospital sheets, with his leg in a cast and his face scraped up from where he'd hit the pavement. "Danny," Frank said, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "I'm Frank Kowalski. We met earlier today at the bus stop." The kid's eyes went wide, and I could see him trying to decide between defiance and terror. Terror won. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "We didn't mean anything by it. We were just fooling around." "I know," Frank said. "But here's the thing about fooling around, son. Sometimes people get hurt. Sometimes the people who get hurt are innocent bystanders who just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." Danny nodded, tears starting to form in his eyes. "Now, I want you to tell me about the man who came to see you and your friends today, the one who scared you so badly that you ran into traffic." Danny's story matched what his friends had told us, but with more detail. Bobby Chen had approached them about an hour after the incident at the bus stop, having apparently spent that time gathering information about what had happened and who was involved. "He didn't threaten us exactly," Danny said, "but he told us stories about you, about what you did in Vietnam. He said you were a hero, and that heroes deserved respect, especially from people who'd never done anything harder than a pop quiz." "What else?" "He said that in the Marine Corps, they have this saying, the more you sweat in training, the less you bleed in combat, and he said that maybe it was time for us to learn what real training looked like." Frank's jaw tightened. "Did he say what kind of training?" "He said he was going to talk to our parents, our school, maybe arrange for us to spend some time volunteering at the VA hospital so we could see what real sacrifice looked like." I had to admit, it didn't sound entirely unreasonable. Misguided, maybe, but not malicious. "Then what happened?" "Then I got smart with him," Danny said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I told him he couldn't do anything to us, that we hadn't broken any laws, and that he should mind his own business." And he just looked at me for like 10 seconds without saying anything. Then he said, "Son, respect isn't about laws. It's about being human. And humanity can be taught, but it's not always a pleasant lesson." That's when Danny had panicked and run. Not because Bobby Chen had threatened him directly, but because something in the man's eyes had told him that his normal teenage tricks weren't going to work here. "Danny," Frank said, "I want you to understand something. The man who talked to you today saved my life in Vietnam. He crawled through enemy territory to reach my squad when we were trapped and outnumbered. He's a good man, but he's also someone who's seen what happens when people don't look out for each other." The kid nodded, clearly not understanding, but trying to process the information. "What you and your friends did today wasn't just disrespectful. It was cruel. And in Bobby's world, cruelty toward people who can't defend themselves is something that needs to be corrected." "I know," Danny whispered. "I'm sorry." "Apologizing to me is a start," Frank said. "But that's not where this ends." Over the next hour, Frank laid out what he expected from Danny and his friends. They would write letters of apology, not just to Frank, but to every elderly person they'd been rude to over the past year. They would volunteer at the VA hospital for 6 months, helping with activities and learning about the men and women who'd served their country. And they would attend a series of classes about respect, responsibility, and the consequences of actions. "This isn't punishment," Frank explained. "This is education. You're going to learn why respect matters, and you're going to learn it by serving people who've earned it. Danny's parents, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped into the room. His mother was crying, and his father looked like he wanted to crawl under a rock. "Mr. Kowalski," Danny's father said, "we had no idea. Danny's told us some of what happened and we're mortified." "Kids make mistakes," Frank said. "The question is what they learn from them." Danny's mother wiped her eyes. "What can we do to make this right?" "Support your son while he does the work I've outlined. Make sure he understands that this isn't about punishment. It's about becoming a better person." As we left the hospital, I found myself thinking about the chain of events that had brought us all together. A simple act of teenage cruelty had set in motion a series of consequences that none of the participants could have predicted. Danny was in the hospital with a broken leg, but maybe he'd also broken through to a new understanding of how his actions affected other people. "You think this will work?" I asked Frank as we waited for the bus. "I think Danny's a good kid who made bad choices," Frank said. "And I think Bobby Chen, in his own heavy-handed way, reminded him that choices have consequences." "Speaking of Bobby Chen, are you going to track him down?" Frank smiled. "Oh, I don't need to track him down. Bobby'll find me. He always does." As if on cue, a black SUV pulled up to the curb beside us. The window rolled down, revealing a man who matched the teenager's description perfectly. Big, scarred, with the kind of presence that fills up a room even when he's sitting in a car. "Gunny," the man said, his voice carrying that particular blend of respect and affection that Marines reserve for their senior NCOs. "Heard you had some trouble today." "Bobby," Frank said, walking over to the SUV. "We need to talk." "Yes, sir, we do. Hop in." I started to hang back, but Frank gestured for me to follow. "Tom Patterson, meet Master Sergeant Bobby Chen, retired. Bobby, Tom's a friend. He was there when the whole thing went down." Bobby Chen was exactly what I'd expected. A man who'd been shaped by decades of military service and combat experience into something harder and more focused than most people ever become. But there was also something gentle in his eyes when he looked at Frank. The kind of respect and affection that comes from shared experience and mutual trust. "Gunny," Bobby said as we drove through the city, "I need you to know that I never intended for that kid to get hurt." "I know that, Bobby, but your methods were a little heavy-handed." "Maybe so, but those kids needed to understand that actions have consequences. You can't just push around old people and expect nothing to happen." Frank was quiet for a moment. "Bobby, I'm 90 years old. I don't need you fighting my battles for me." "With respect, Gunny, it's not about fighting your battles. It's about maintaining standards. Those kids disrespected a Marine, and Marines don't let that slide." "Times change, Bobby. Kids today aren't the same as kids 50 years ago." "No, they're not. They're softer, more entitled, less aware of what real sacrifice looks like, which means they need the lessons even more." I could see both sides of the argument. Frank was right that Bobby's intervention had escalated a minor incident into something more serious. But Bobby was also right that the teenager's behavior had been genuinely cruel and needed to be addressed. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Someplace where we can talk without being interrupted," Bobby said. "There's more to this story than you know." We drove to a small park in an older part of the city, the kind of neighborhood where the houses were built in the 1940s for returning veterans and their families.
Bobby parked under a big oak tree, and we got out to sit at a picnic table that looked like it had been there since the Eisenhower administration.
"Frank," Bobby said, "I need to tell you something. Those kids today weren't just random jerks. They've been targeting elderly people in that neighborhood for months." Frank's expression sharpened. "What do you mean, targeting?" "I mean they've got a pattern. They find old people who look vulnerable, harass them, humiliate them, sometimes even rob them. The cops know about it, but they're juveniles and they're careful not to do anything that rises to the level of serious crime." I felt a chill run down my spine. "How do you know this?" "Because I've been investigating it," Bobby said. "My company provides security for several businesses in that area, and we've been getting reports for weeks. Elderly customers being intimidated, threatened, made to feel unsafe." He pulled out a tablet and showed us a series of photos and incident reports. It painted a picture of systematic harassment that went far beyond normal teenage misbehavior. "These kids have figured out that elderly people are easy targets," Bobby continued. "They're less likely to fight back, less likely to report incidents to police, and even when they do report, they're often not taken seriously." Frank studied the reports, his expression growing darker with each page. "How many victims?" "At least a dozen that we know of. Probably more who haven't reported anything." "And the police?" "Are doing what they can, but their hands are tied. No serious crimes committed, just a pattern of low-level harassment that's hard to prosecute." I was beginning to understand why Bobby had taken such a direct approach with the teenagers.
This wasn't just about defending Frank's honor. It was about stopping a pattern of predatory behavior. "So, when you heard about what happened to Frank," I said,
"I decided it was time to send a message,"
Bobby finished.
"These kids needed to understand that their victims weren't as helpless as they thought."
Frank was quiet for a long time, processing this information. Finally, he looked up at Bobby.
"So what's the plan?" "The plan is to make those kids understand the real consequences of their actions, and to make sure they never target another elderly person again."
"How?" Bobby smiled, and for the first time I could see the Marine Corps strategist behind the security contractor.
"Community service, education, and a healthy dose of perspective. Danny's accident was unfortunate, but it might actually work in our favor."
Over the next hour, Bobby laid out a comprehensive plan that was part rehabilitation, part education, and part old-fashioned Marine Corps discipline.
The teenagers would indeed volunteer at the VA hospital, but they'd also work with elderly residents in local nursing homes, help with community cleanup projects, and attend classes about the history and sacrifice of American veterans. "But here's the key," Bobby said. "This isn't going to be some feel-good community service where they show up for a few hours and get a certificate. This is going to be real work with real responsibility, supervised by people who won't tolerate half measures." "People like you?" Frank asked. "People like us," Bobby corrected. "Frank, these kids need to learn from someone they can respect. You've got the experience, the credibility, and the moral authority to teach them what they need to know." I could see Frank considering the idea. "You want me to become their mentor?" "I want you to become their teacher. Show them what real service looks like, what sacrifice means, what respect is really about." It was an ambitious plan, but as Bobby explained the details, I began to see how it might work. The teenagers would be immersed in a world where their normal tricks and attitudes wouldn't work, where they'd be surrounded by people who'd earned respect through genuine sacrifice and service. "What about Danny?" I asked. "He's going to be in that cast for months." "Danny's going to have plenty of time to think about his choices," Bobby said, "and when he's ready, he'll join the program too." Frank was nodding slowly. "It could work, but it's going to take time, and it's going to take commitment from everyone involved." "Time we've got," Bobby said, "and commitment is what Marines do best." As the sun began to set, we drove back toward the original neighborhood where this whole thing had started. The bus stop where Frank had been harassed was empty now, just a bench and a sign marking the route schedule. "You know," Frank said as we got out of Bobby's SUV, "when I woke up this morning, I thought I was just going to the VA for a routine checkup." "Funny how life works," I said. "Not funny," Bobby corrected. "Purposeful. Things happen for a reason, and today those kids learned that their actions have consequences they never expected." We stood there for a moment, three men from different generations who'd been brought together by circumstance and a shared understanding of what service and respect really mean. "So what happens now?" I asked. Frank looked at Bobby, then at me. "Now, we get to work. Those kids are going to learn what it means to serve something bigger than themselves, even if we have to drag them kicking and screaming to the lesson." 6 months later, I ran into Danny at the grocery store. I almost didn't recognize him. He'd grown a few inches, filled out some, and carried himself with a confidence that hadn't been there before. He was wearing a volunteer t-shirt from the VA hospital and helping an elderly woman load groceries into her car. When he saw me, he came over with a big smile. "Mr. Patterson, how are you doing?" "Good, Danny. How's the leg?" "All healed up. And hey, I wanted to thank you for what you and Mr. Kowalski and Sergeant Chen did for us." "What do you mean?" "I mean for not giving up on us, for showing us that there was a better way to be." He told me about the past 6 months, the hours spent at the VA hospital listening to veterans' stories, the work at nursing homes, the classes about military history and the meaning of service. It hadn't been easy, and there had been moments when he and his friends had wanted to quit. "But Mr. Kowalski wouldn't let us," Danny said. "He told us that Marines don't quit, and that if we were going to learn from Marines, we weren't going to quit either." "And now?" "Now I'm thinking about joining the Marines myself when I graduate. Mr. Kowalski says I might have what it takes, if I keep working at it." As I watched Danny help the elderly woman with her groceries, I thought about the chain of events that had brought us all together. A moment of teenage cruelty had set in motion a series of consequences that had ultimately led to genuine transformation and growth. Frank Kowalski had gotten his justice, but more importantly, he'd gotten the chance to turn a negative experience into something positive. Bobby Chen had gotten to honor his oath to never leave a fellow Marine behind, and 5 teenagers had learned lessons about respect, service, and responsibility that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Sometimes the universe has a way of working things out in ways we never expect. Sometimes the people who look the most vulnerable turn out to be the strongest, and sometimes a simple act of kindness or cruelty can set in motion a chain of events that changes everyone involved. As I drove home that day, I found myself thinking about all the Frank Kowalskis out there. Elderly veterans whose service and sacrifice have been forgotten by a society that moves too fast to remember its heroes. And I thought about all the Bobby Chens still fighting to honor the bonds forged in combat decades ago. But mostly, I thought about Danny and his friends, and how a broken leg and 6 months of hard work had turned 5 potential delinquents into young men who understood what respect really means. It wasn't the ending any of us had expected when this whole thing started, but it was the ending we all needed. And sometimes, that's the best kind of justice there is.